Good morning. Thank you for joining us on this SAG-AFTRA live stream on YouTube. To stay informed about all of our live stream and video events, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. You can do that right now. Today, we present the President's Task Force on Education Outreach and Engagement live stream covering the story of race. Today's event is live captioned, and you can activate the subtitles by selecting the captioning option on the Zoom palette. We're also joined by American Sign Language interpreters, Andrea Lust and Sharon Pierre-Louis, who are translating today's program into American Sign Language. They will be switching off periodically throughout the discussion. The presentation will begin momentarily. If you have questions that you'd like to direct to today's guests, please email pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and you can watch the replay right here on SAG-AFTRA YouTube, along with more great content. Now, please give a warm welcome to today's host, SAG-AFTRA President, Gabrielle Carteris.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today we have a really great discussion. We're joined by some of our esteemed industry colleagues, and I'm very excited about our topic. We're covering the story of race, where we're going to take a look at some real life examples of media coverage, unpack the issues around our need for diverse voices when reporting on crucial issues, examine how stories are assigned, shaped, and covered in the newsroom, and discuss best practices for telling stories. So before we kick off, though, I just want to say hello and thank you to our panelists who've joined us today, to Carolyn Tyler, our moderator, and of course to our SAG-AFTRA broadcast department for helping us bring this event to life. And I also, before I go any further, want to recognize and introduce SAG-AFTRA Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon. Hi, Rebecca. It's already been a long day. Who's going to be part of today's event. Thank you for being here, all of you. So, a few months ago, SAG-AFTRA's Broadcast Steering Committee, which is a committee comprised of broadcast journalists around the country, issued a statement on newsroom diversity. They detailed ways in which the coronavirus pandemic, Black Lives Matter, demonstrations, all these things have exposed inequities in healthcare, jobs, criminal justice, and schools, while also exposing a significant lack of diversity in many of the newsrooms called upon to report on these related stories and issues. So as an organization, SAG-AFTRA believes that radio, television, online news organizations should truly represent and reflect the multicultural communities that they serve. And as such, we put out a call to action, actually urging employers to actively search for qualified non-white staff members. We also asked employers to devote resources to provide meaningful professional development and mentorship opportunities for their employees, creating access. We've seen, as we've seen in history and most recently in the past few months, the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the outcry over police brutality have underscored the effects of racial inequities that still today permeate throughout society. So I've seen and I've read many news stories on the lack of diversity in the newsroom. Recently, many of us watched the video of Van Jones. It was such an important moment when he broke down on screen while detailing how he's personally been affected by the stories he's reported on. And it's just one example of a much broader and heavily discussed conversation. So there's a lot to unpack today in our discussion. I don't want to take up any more time. So please, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Carolyn Tyler. Now, Carolyn is a longtime SAG-AFTRA member, a Bay Area broadcast legend, more than that. She recently retired from ABC San Francisco, where she was both an anchor and a reporter for over 30 years, which is impressive in itself. During her career, she has covered homelessness, marriage equality, civil rights issues, and much more. She was actually part of the team that earned KGO-TV a Peabody Award for its on-air coverage of the Loma Prieta earthquake. She is the recipient of National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Silver Circle Award and an A. Philip Randolph Institute's Rosa Parks Legacy Award and the Media Award from the Bay Area Coalition of 100 Black Women. Such an honor, such a privilege to have Carolyn with us today. So thank you, Carolyn, for being here. We're happy you can join us in a much needed conversation. So without further ado, I pass it to you.
Gabrielle, thank you so much for those kind words of introduction. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm especially pleased that SAG-AFTRA is recognizing the need to tackle this critical issue in the nation today and in our industry. This is a conversation that needs to be taking place not just in newsrooms around the country, but in workplaces around the nation. So I salute the union for looking into this. And today we're going to delve into this thorny topic with three highly esteemed journalists. First, let's talk to Tahman Bradley. Let me introduce him. He is a Chicago native who anchors WGN Evening News, and he also serves as the station's political reporter. Tahman has an extensive background in reporting breaking news, covering everything from the Boston Marathon bombing to the Sandy Hook tragedy to the crisis in Ferguson. He also pioneered digital journalism for ABC with in-depth coverage of the US auto industry, the impact of the BP oil spill in the Gulf, and other issues. Welcome, Tahman. And we have
Thank you very much.
Lucy Bustamante, who is a morning news anchor for NBC 10 and breaking news anchor for Telemundo 62 in Philadelphia. Lucy is a two-time Emmy Award winner for her work anchoring the explosion of the Philadelphia Energy Solutions plant and is a Peabody Award winner for her coverage of Hurricane Katrina when she was evening anchor for WWL in New Orleans. Lucy is a former and founding president of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And she's been involved with the Naval Officers Spouses Association, as well as the NBC Universal Veterans Network. Good morning, Lucy.
Morning, thank you.
And we have Emily Elena Dugdale. Emily is a KPCC LA East reporter covering criminal justice and veterans issues following a stint as a general assignment reporter. Emily is currently working on a really important one-year collaboration with ProPublica on a series of investigative stories talking about institutional racism, investigating this in Antelope Valley, focusing on housing, education, and law enforcement. Emily previously co-reported and produced the offshore podcast from Honolulu, Civil Beat, and spent her early career reporting for local news outlets in the Bay Area. Good morning, Emily.
Hi, good morning.
Here. I'd like to start off with a quote that is a rather biting critique of the news industry. And it says, "The press has too long basked in a white world, looking out of it with a white man's eyes and white perspective." This was 50 years ago. Little over 50 years ago. This was criticism from the Kerner Commission, which was devised and created as a way of looking at the underlying issues and causes of urban unrest during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And this was a landmark study that included a chapter on the media. And it was pretty damning, pretty scathing. It called for a readjustment of the news media, the way it covers communities of color. Tahman, I'm wondering how that readjustment has gone.
Well, first of all, Caroline, thank you so much, Madam President. It's an honor to be here. We've got a long way to go, right? Think back to 1967 when that report was put out to try to understand the cause of the riots, what was going on in America. And I bet if the president-elect commissioned a similar report today, he would find the exact same things, right? They talked about lack of economic opportunity, failed social service programs, police brutality, racism, and white-oriented media. So we've made some progress, but we've got a long way to go. And when you look at that, it's not just a matter of diversity in terms of people who are on camera. I think in big cities and at networks, you do see diversity in terms of anchors and reporters. But what matters is behind the scenes in terms of producers, the editors, the news director, the president of the news organization, the vice president. Those are the people who make decisions. Those are the people who decide what stories are pursued, how stories are crafted, set the agenda. And there's a monumental lack of diversity in the higher ranks. And so I'm heartened that SAG-AFTRA is taking this on because organizations like this have to hold news organizations, news companies accountable to ensuring that there is diversity. Specifically, when we talk about recent events, when you look at the unrest that we saw following the police shooting of, or the police killing, I should say, of George Floyd, the story was covered well. I think even if there were polls that reflected among African Americans thought that the news media did a good job. But when we saw unrest, maybe that's where we fell a little bit short in terms of how we told that story, the words we used, the language that we used, rioting, maybe not always understanding rioting. Dr. King said a riot is the language of the unheard. And perhaps that was sometimes missing from what was going on. I know we'll get into that later, but look, 1967, 2020, we still have some of the same challenges in terms of how race is covered by the media.
So you mentioned the what some people will call window dressing, that we have faces that people can see on air, but behind the scenes, there are a lot of studies that say, I think it's 6% of the nation's news directors are Black or people of color. Lucy, how does that impact your ability to cover stories?
You know, what's interesting about this conversation as it applies to coverage in Philadelphia right now, and especially working for an NBC and Telemundo station, is that, you know, we have like the perfect setup, right? We have NBC and Telemundo in the same exact newsroom. We can hear each other talk Spanish and English in the same room, in the same space. And the conversations that I always try to have is not just taking the script that was written in English and then translating it for the newscast on Telemundo that is an hour later and saying it verbatim, running it through Google Translate, for example. You really have to translate the meaning culturally of what you're covering. For example, we have seen the Dreamers case, if you can remember before coronavirus, the Dreamers case be ruled on, and having to explain, you don't have to explain to the Latino community what it is to migrate to this country and to be in fear of being sent back. The only country that you've ever known because maybe your parents got here when you were 2 years old. That needs no translation when I'm writing that script on the Telemundo network and I'm writing it for that audience. But that does need translation when I'm writing that same story for NBC. And to make those cultural sensitivities something that both sides can have an understanding of, it can be a tricky situation. What you all were discussing just now of having people of color in the ranks that can say to you as your manager, yes, that is a good story, that you don't have to explain it that extra 10 minutes because they understand the relevance. But then at the same time, that doesn't take the responsibility off of me as a journalist to explain it to the white population that maybe can't relate. Not out of malice, not out of anything other than they haven't walked that walk. But that's my opportunity to say, to introduce you to that 19-year-old girl waiting to see if she's going to go back to a country that she has never stepped foot in, that she has never had to get to know other than her family here in the United States, and to have that ripped away. To explain to them why it is that Cuban Americans were allowed to migrate in a very different way than Mexicans are allowed to migrate. And so to have that diversity in the ranks gets you to the product, to the end product faster, to a faster place of understanding for the audience, because you understand at a higher level in your newsroom the importance of getting that aspect out there. And ideally, guys, this is what this racial sensitivity training is about. It's about compassion. How do we get to that compassion faster? How do we hire people that can be bridges in our newsrooms so that we don't have to tear down the walls and climb up the walls? And I always say, that's great. I'm the first Latina and whatever. That's wonderful. We need 20 more. And so, in my work environment, it has ebbed and flowed without a doubt, never out of malice, just out of, unconscious bias, if you will. But the thing about journalists is that if all things go the way that they should be, is that we are naturally curious people, and our curiosity should not stop short of our personal biases that maybe we're just not conscious of. So, for example, covering coronavirus here, the people of color are being affected at a completely disproportionate number compared to the size of the population. And I was talking to our doctor today, and I'll wrap this up with now so everyone else can have a discussion as well. But Dr. Ayla Stanford, who's with the Black Doctors Consortium here, was saying, how dare we continue to put the same testing parameters on these populations where you have to drive up to the site when we know that people of color, don't have cars in the same numbers as, people who are white to get to these testing sites. You have to have basically all these barriers that gets them to testing. And as she put it, she says, now that we're getting ready to roll out this vaccine, we have the same exact barriers in place. We have changed nothing from the time that we were asking them to get tested to the time that we're asking them to get a vaccine. So because we are people of color in our newsrooms, and I know the limitations of the audience that I talk to when I am addressing Telemundo, I know that I have to change that script so that I can communicate with the people that I grew up with so that they can have an understanding of, this is where you go get your, your vacuna, and this is where you go get your test. And this is where you, without fear of, getting caught or, there's so much of an element of fear in populations of color. And that doesn't matter if you're Latina or if you're Black. That's something we all have in common.
But what a difference it makes that you are in that newsroom to be able to tell that story. Because if you weren't there and did not have that sensitivity and that background knowledge, who would be there to tell that story? And so, Emily, I wanted to ask you also, when you talk about issues like COVID or the Black Lives Matter protests or even the presidential election, all of those had racial components. What's the impact in a newsroom that doesn't reflect America?
I mean, I think the impact is that we miss those stories, or we miss part of the stories that are really important to tell. I work for an NPR station. NPR has historically a very white audience. And this year we've done a lot of thinking about that, I think, across the organization of who are we really talking to? There's stations that really don't even have good demographic information on their audience, which makes it really hard to know who you're talking to and, to tell these stories. I think with the Black Lives Matter protests and all the, this moment that we saw this summer, even in my newsroom, there were things getting dropped. It's not because we didn't have reporters of color on staff. We had producers of color as well, but like others have said, some people in charge, a lot of them are white. And I think that does make a difference. A lot of our editors, I think, just didn't even, they didn't realize that moment, not only for our listening audience, but also for us journalists of color who were really covering that moment. And I also think I want to talk about, something that I don't think we talk enough about, and that is that, these groups that we think of, people of color, Latinx, Black folks, they're not a monolithic audience. We've talked about that with the election, but I think we do need to talk about that in terms of our reporting as well for everybody. Is like, I'm a mixed race Afro-Latina. I identify in a lot of different ways. Close friends of mine are fourth generation Angelenos who are Mexican American, who don't speak Spanish. That's a very different experience than somebody who's immigrated here to LA. So I think when we talk about these audiences, we really need to understand that we are reaching a lot of different people and a lot of different identities and places. And it's not fair to just say, okay, well, we're going to reach Latinos and it's fine. Like, who are we even talking about? Are you talking about Abuela? Are you talking about the guy who's never, he's never been to Mexico before? With Black folks too, who are we talking about when we're talking about these moments? The folks who are protesting might have a different view than some of the folks who've lived in South Central for 40 years. You know what I'm saying? So I think that that's been a frustration of mine. And I think going back to your original question of, what the impact is on your newsrooms, when you have people who don't know those histories of your own cities, when you have people who don't maybe understand the intersectionality of race, identity, ethnicity, that's where those types of threads can get dropped too. That's when you can get into these kind of lazy, I call react stories, when you're just like, okay, like, let's go hear what Black folks think. Let's go to Lemmer Park and just talk to some people. Like, okay, like, guess what? 20% of our high desert region is now Black, like, it's because they got priced out and so they're moving up there. Let's go, we got to understand like the implications of what's going on. So that's kind of a long answer just to say that I think we really need to reevaluate the way we talk about our communities in a way that's more holistic to the way they're talking about themselves.
Well, I think it's obvious pollsters got that wrong in the presidential election, thinking that the Latinx community was a monolith instead of recognizing, as you said, and as Lucy mentioned, Cuban Americans are different than Venezuelan Americans and Dominicans. And I mean, it depends on religion and socioeconomic status and immigration history. And there are a lot of different things to take into account. And if you don't have that diversity in the newsroom, then who's to say? But Tahman, diversity, as you mentioned, is really not, it's not enough alone just to say, oh, I've got these faces. I mean, there was an article in last year that looked at race and media in Pittsburgh, and it said the mere presence of people of color in a workplace does not guarantee they will be given the level of agency to affect change. Have you recognized that in your newsroom? Can you speak freely without fear of repercussions? Or I know in my newsroom, I was always worried as the only Black female of being labeled the angry Black woman just by bringing up issues that I thought needed to be addressed.
So, throughout my career, I have purposely sort of avoided taking on the Black topic stories so that I'm not labeled as that. With a reporting background in national politics, I sought, when I came to Chicago, to be the political reporter. It just made sense. So that's my niche, in addition to anchoring. But look, I've purposely avoided, the Black celebrity is in the news, you go do that story. That is just, I didn't want to be trapped into doing that. But I do speak out when it's needed, when the perspective is needed. But let me just give you a sense, though, because I think representation matters. And I think we've got to get the numbers up. We need more people of color in newsrooms and decision-making roles. So we have two big editorial meetings. One is at 11 o'clock in the morning. The other is at 2 in the afternoon. And there are 15 to 20 people maybe who attend those meetings. At that 11 o'clock, there's a Latina anchor who regularly goes. Other than that, it's all white. At 2 o'clock, there is a Black woman who's on our assignment desk who goes. Sometimes that Latina anchor is there. Otherwise, it is all white. Our 4 o'clock producer, our 5 o'clock producer, our 6 o'clock producer, our 9 o'clock producer, our 10 o'clock producer, they are white. On the weekends, 5, 9, 10, white. That's a problem. I mean, those are just the numbers. That's the honest to goodness truth. But on air, we do look like Chicago. That's important. But the decision makers are not diverse. And to give you a sense of the disconnect, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the conversations that people have at home, in analyzing the election results or what's happening in the world are often not reflected on television or radio or in print. Think about how many broadcast scripts, I'm sure Lucy would agree with this, have had the 2 words white nationalism. But think about how often you've talked about that at home or with your friends. We don't discuss that in the news. It doesn't come up in my political stories as often as I would like. And so, the other thing I'd say too, I'd use this as an example because you probably have heard of Kim Foxx, who is the Cook County State's attorney, and she just was up for re-election. She famously dropped charges against Jesse Smollett, accused of staging a hate crime attack against himself, drew national attention. She's a reform-minded, progressive prosecutor, wanting to expunge low-level drug offenses, get people out of jail for low-level offenses and stuff like that. Reform mind. So Cook County, very much a Democratic county. Black voters, and I'm going to generalize here, Black voters are sort of kingmakers in the county and decide who wins. So in the general election, we would have newsroom conversations about, okay, she's got this Republican opponent. He's got a little bit of money, but she's still got the establishment. This Jesse Smollett thing, this is holding her down. We got to cover this race. And so, I have to say to the assignment desk and show producers, I've seen polling in this race. This thing is not close. But no, she mishandled this or whatever. No, you're not understanding the county. Maybe we need to litigate whether or not it was appropriate for her to have dropped the charges and text messages from Michelle Obama's former chief of staff and all of that. But the reality is the people of the county, right or wrong, agree with her reforms, and she maintains support among the establishment. This is not a story we should pursue. There are other interesting political races that we have to cover. And again, so that's why I find my role as a political reporter very important in terms of agenda setting. And these are stories we should tell. These are the stories we shouldn't. And so you need more people like me behind the scenes, not just on air, but in those meetings. I can't always go to those meetings. Sometimes I'm out with a source or I'm chasing a story.
And so, Lucy or Emily, how do we get to that point of getting people behind the scenes? What is it going to take? Because a lot of young people coming out of journalism school, what they think of is, I want to be on camera, because that's what they see. Right. But really the power lies behind the scenes. But I don't see that much effort to recruit, retrain, retain. What can stations do?
Emily, you want to take it first?
No, Lucy, go for it.
Okay, sounds good. I'll tell you a couple of answers to this question. We just reestablished the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Philadelphia chapter with the assistance of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. They funded it, basically. And we worked primarily in the first year as a networking organization to get the people that are hiring connected to mostly Temple journalism students that, you know, some were bilingual, some weren't. So we try to be that bridge. So if you guys know of these organizations, if you're involved in them, that is a great place to turn your employers, your HR department, say, hey, look at these members. You know, you get involved in those groups to help your networking. Obviously, this year the convention was a little strange, being virtual, but they did a decent job in trying to get everyone matched up and be seen as best as we can do this year. Second, to go back to what you're saying, Tahman's point, absolutely. It depends what shift you're on in your newsroom, on whether you have people of color in management. And depending on the makeup of your shift, the product will be completely different in the sense of tone and thoughts behind the put together, how you put it together. And the stories that will be maybe discussed or approved will be completely different in their approach, depending on the makeup. Because like you guys said, it's not just the diversity, it's who is included. That's the biggest part, who is included. And I see some of the questions popping up here saying, what's the best way to approach? My God, this is the most important part of this conversation, because I know that people of color right now, we are exhausted and seeing that we've been exhausted way before it became a national conversation, you know, because of the crises, multiple crises, George Floyd being the biggest that brought on this conversation. But we finally have an audience that wants to do better, and we have to believe that they want to do better. So I always say, to the people that in my life, right? Because I grew up in a mostly white world, and, you know, my parents come from Cuba and Spain, and they were just trying to fit in. And you know, you learn how to survive in an environment where I didn't speak English till I was 6 years old, you know, so there's a survival skill with that. And living in the duality of white and quote minority, which we're now getting away from because it doesn't do your community justice to just be called a quote minority. It tells you nothing about the person and their experience. But I always say, have it one-on-one in a comfortable space. I have no problem at all answering questions about, wait, you speak Spanish, but you're white. That's question number one that I get. You know, question number two is, were your parents legal? Question number three is, you know, there's so many, but you can tell when it's well-meaning, and you can tell when it's toxic. And the beauty of what's happened now with all of these new training programs and diversity and inclusion and anti-racism, this and that, is that we finally have a vocabulary that is being put into HR departments all over the country. And if it works the way that it's supposed to, we are not supposed to be retaliated against by bringing it up and saying, that doesn't make me very comfortable. So-and-so said this, and I don't know if they meant it that way. But they're telling us intention doesn't matter. Intention doesn't matter. You shouldn't have to suffer the micro and macro aggressions that we have suffered in the past just for the sake of our survival, to be able to, quote, make it. So that is a new dawn. That is a silver lining that has come as a result of this. But it's us. We are the stewards of that now. We are the ones that have to make sure that these things are going to be implemented in earnest and psychologically safely. Like the psychological safety behind this plan of diversity and inclusion is everything. So find your friend that you feel comfortable with, start it off there. And if not, maybe, I don't know what people's environments are like at work, maybe take it to your HR department and say, I don't know how to address this. But that's exactly why we need to have more middle managers in these positions that are of color to facilitate that.
I would say, if not now, when, as Dr. King said many years ago. And so, Elena, a lot of people have tried to say there is an economic component for stations to understand that this is a different America. If you want to survive, you need to have coverage that looks like everybody. But it appears for some, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need a moral imperative. This is your responsibility, you meaning the media. We are supposed to be here. Our mission is supposed to be to serve. You have an obligation, a responsibility to be inclusive.
Right.
I'm wondering your thoughts, Elena.
Yeah.
Emily, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I go by both, so it's all right. Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation we've been having in my newsroom. It's a conversation that like NPR, our kind of, you know, mothership, has been having. You know, our listener base, like I said, is largely white, largely older. They're not going to be around forever. That's how the world works. And so it is like, you know, the economics of the situation are very apparent. I think for us that we need to change, and if we don't, it's going to be a problem. I think that I want to go, I guess there's a question in the chat that I think is interesting because, and is a little bit related, but I think that someone said that their station was hiring people of color in entry-level positions, but not providing any support for them, mentoring or career advice. And I think that is kind of one of the problems that's kind of making this happen, is that people get put, you know, they might get hired in an entry-level position, but there's no one there to help them. There's no mentorship. There might not be a developmental pathway so that they can become middle managers, or they can become an editor, or maybe have someone that can guide something like a mission statement, which was where you get at that moral imperative to do a different type of journalism, a more thoughtful journalism, a journalism that attacks systemic racism, that says this is real. If you don't have people who have a lived experience of that, if you know, a real lived experience of racism, of confronting it, like all of us on this panel, I'm sure, have stories about that. I don't know if honestly a station will really come to understand why a moral imperative and like why a message to send to your audience that this is what we care about is so important. So, you know, something that Lucy had said before was how NAHJ was kind of trying to, you know, create this bridge of mentorship, which I think is so wonderful. And our affinity groups do so much for that. I also think that in order for things to really change, stations have to put the money up to do it. You know, nothing's really going to get done unless they earmark money for developmental opportunities, unless they create a mentorship program, because as great as other outside groups are, they also are stretched thin. You know, they don't have mentors for every young journalist in the, you know, in your area. And, you know, I'm a millennial, I'm fairly young, I'm still very early into my career. And so the mentors that I had like made me feel more confident to do the type of journalism that I wanted to do, to stand up when I had people who told me, I don't think this story is really right for us, and to work to be a better part of my newsroom. I'm on our DEI task force right now. I'm an active member of our SAG-AFTRA union pushing for DEI efforts. And I truly don't think that I would have been in that position if I hadn't had mentors of color, particularly women of color, and particularly Black women who really gave me that voice. So do I think there's a moral imperative? Absolutely, because you're not gonna survive unless you care about this. And if you care about this, you got to talk to the people on your staff who look like us. Yeah.
And I think when you talk about the affinity groups, the NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, and the Hispanic Association, the stations have to do more than send someone there to check a box.
Yes.
Which I found to be the case, to say, oh, we went and we looked. But you have to, Tahman, acknowledge, first of all, that there's a problem.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it seems like some are in a mindset that we can just continue business as usual. Yes, this is a pivotal point in time, but we will just keep on doing what we're doing. What is going to shake that? what's going to resonate finally?
So Emily is absolutely right about mentorship, and the importance of being able to grow up at these institutions, to fail. I look at my own career where I started at ABC News Network 3 weeks after I graduated college. Was I prepared to be there? No. But I figured it out, and I did. I sort of skipped entry level steps, working assignment desk, things like that you would do, and started as the title was field producer. Essentially, I was an off-air reporter, worked my way through the political unit, then worked my way on air there, which is not the way to do it. You'd much rather fail and have your bumps in smaller places, but that wasn't my path. And obviously being green, even just basic things like how you conduct yourself as a professional, that is important for a young person in their 20s, trying to figure out this business. And I know that everyone on this panel can relate to when you get into an institution and the other people of color immediately come up to you, and it's warm and it's love and, hey, what do you need? Are you going to be okay? That's why the inclusion and the diversity matters, because there's that support group, there's that network there to ensure that you will grow. And I look at networks. I think back at 10 years ago when I was basically launching my on-air career, and there were not a lot of young people of color on air then, right? It was very much. There was a way that you were as a correspondent at a network, right? There was a way you looked. There was stuff that was on your resume, where you went to school, all of that. You check those boxes. The networks are much more open-minded these days because I think they do see that it is in their business interest to have diversity. It's fashionable to have some color. But I question whether or not for some of those people that'll be sustainable, because they were pulled and put in those positions because it's the hot thing right now. But if they haven't learned the craft, if they haven't paid the necessary dues and made themselves essential, owned a beat, they can sort of be replaced by whoever is the flavor of next month. And that I worry about, particularly because behind those folks are successful are still not there. That's why it's imperative that SAG-AFTRA and NABJ and outside organizations look at corporate boards, hold these organizations accountable, look at the vice presidents of companies, look at the news directors, the producers, put out reports on diversity. And I think we can make a difference. I always go back to in Chicago, Lester Holt, NBC Nightly News anchor. He got his job because the CBS station here in Chicago, Channel 2, had gotten rid of Harry Potterfield, an anchor, a black man, I believe the only black male anchor at any of the stations in town in the 80s. And Jesse Jackson led a boycott of the station. And so they felt the economic heat, and they found Lester Holt and hired him. And so, now he's, one of the most powerful anchors in the world. Got his start from outside pressure. That stuff matters. And so SAG-AFTRA, you could take notes here and we can go and we can put out our reports and we can put pressure, and, who knows what we might be able to do.
And I think that is a good time to go back to Gabrielle, and they have some questions that have been coming in from members of the union. One thing I would like to quickly add is that with the dearth of people of color in those management positions currently, white managers can also be allies. I had a white mentor, male, who took an interest in me and helped me develop. So it doesn't have to just be a person of color. If you're out there and you're interested and you say, what can I do? You've heard some ideas from the panel today. The other thing I would say is that I would hope that some of the stations that offer internships would make them paid internships, because if you are as I was coming up, I was offered an internship. It was unpaid. And as a college kid, I couldn't take it. I was working my way through school. So that automatically cuts off some of the pipeline of
Sure.
people trying to get into the business. Gabrielle, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. What a great, great discussion. Thank you so much for leading it. So one of the questions that came out was, I'm not a person of color, but I want to make sure I am working these stories effectively. What would you recommend that I do to make sure that I am getting the story right? Is it appropriate to reach out to my colleagues who are people of color and ask for their help? And I leave that for anybody here who wants to answer that question, or several different people.
Sure. I'll take it real quick. I would say that it is absolutely appropriate for you to go to your coworkers that are members of these communities. And the way that I would word it is say, are there any contacts that you might have that you recommend? And go at it that way, because you don't know, especially right now, where a lot of the coverage that we are watching and that we are covering is very traumatic. And if you just ask them for, can you give me some good contacts that you may have used? I think that's a really healthy way of approaching it. And that might start off the dialogue. It depends on how close you are with your coworkers too. You know, you might say, you might ask a friend, how are you doing? Has this been traumatic for you? But you have to have a certain comfort level. But I think just by asking for, you know, can you share some contacts among your coworkers, that's a professional way of getting into the conversation. The other thing is when you reach out to these community centers, they will definitely know. If you know that there's a Spanish speaking doctor, they can point you to the right direction when it comes to coronavirus coverage among the Latino population. Black physicians especially can tell you how hard it is to get a Black person to the doctor versus a white person to the doctor. So I would say keep going at it with a pure, clean heart, and you really could do no wrong with your approach.
If I could add to that, I would just say that talk to as many people as possible. It may be a little annoying, but all day long, I have people texting me with pitches, ideas. I would say out of the 25 during a week, one of them make it into a story or become a story. But I always have people telling me what they think about various things. And they're from all walks of life, and they're from all different backgrounds. And I digest that, and I look at it, and I process it. And I think it informs my thinking, and it informs how I approach stories.
I always told my colleagues to feel free to come to me, that I was a soft place for them, that I was not going to judge them, that I would rather they ask me. And also, if they were going to use my contacts, to be sure to let the contact know that I sent them, so that then they would have a certain feeling of comfort. And the other thing that I would say, which is part of what that Kerner Commission report said a long time ago, was how the media does not focus on the ordinariness of people of color. And so I would tell my colleagues, if you're going out and you're doing man on the streets about the latest, you know, Apple phone or whatever it might be, make sure that you go up and ask people of various, I would always try to do gender and racial differences, and just to make people see that we're all part of the same community. It doesn't have to be a story about crime. It doesn't have to be a story about poverty. Just a regular, ordinary story, and you're putting everyone in it.
Right, you're showing the true quilt of our country by doing that.
I would just add really quickly, and I think I have kind of a different opinion on that question, but I wouldn't kind of just go up and start asking your random coworkers of color, you know, about kind of how to approach a story. I'm happy to talk to people that I know in my newsroom about it, but I probably wouldn't want people to read me as an open invitation to just come to, because this has been a really hard time. Like Lucy was saying, emotionally, I'm not always gonna be ready to talk to you and make you understand racism or make you understand how Black folks feel or Latinx folks. Not every day for me. So I think it's great that some of y'all have really like opened yourself up and been very public about that. But I think there's going to be people like me who might not want to do that in your newsroom. So like Lucy said, I think I would really focus on going to people you already have an established relationship with. And also the internet is a great resource. If there are lots of journalists out there who have written about this topic, who are doing blog posts, who are compiling resources, Instagram stories. One thing we hear a lot about when we're talking about systemic racism is like, make sure to do your work, right? Do your own due diligence, do your own work before you go and ask people questions that might be easily answered with a Google search. So I'm just saying, I just want to put a little caveat on that for some of the folks like me who may be feeling pretty tired and exhausted at this point.
Read the room.
Can I ask a question to that, Emily? So, because I think that it is good to hear the different perspectives on it, right? So one is community building in some ways, and the other is, I totally hear that. Then how does one know? How does one know where, you might be at, versus maybe Carolyn or Lucy? Like, how would they know unless, is there a way to approach you or others so that there could be clarity on that?
I think you just need to assume that unless people have really been open about, hey, please ask me anything, or I'm here to talk to you about things. Unless people have openly done that, I wouldn't assume that people want to talk about that. So I think, again, I haven't worked in a lot. I haven't worked in a lot of newsrooms with a large community of reporters and producers of color. So maybe it would be different if there was a lot of people around who looked like that and had really created, employee resource groups around different backgrounds, such and such. I think one good thing right now about what's been going on is that some folks have really stepped up and said like, hey, like I want to be there. I want to be a resource.
Right.
But I think there's also a tendency for folks to just, think, okay, well, I have to ask a person of color because they're a person of color. Whereas there's a lot of resources being written right now for white people to understand and unpack and break down these topics. So I don't know. I think my answer to your question is just assume that people want to just be doing their own thing unless they say otherwise.
Okay, that's great. I just think it's.
I think it depends on the relationships you have within your newsroom, because before I left my newsroom, most of the other reporters were friends, if not friendly, and I would rather help them get things right, or at least put them, in the right spot, than to have them go off and do something that does not make sense. And then there's blowback on the station for the coverage. So, but I do understand it's exhausting for Black people and brown people and yellow people to be explaining, having to deal with our pain and repeating that over and over again to a white audience. I totally understand that, Emily.
I think that then if you're the person who's getting asked a lot of those questions and maybe you've opened yourself up to that, I think that's great. I really I have no personal problem with that. I applaud anyone who feels like they can do that. But then I think you really need to ask for a raise or ask for some extra money, because if you are guiding the station's coverage because all the other reporters are coming to you asking about things, you need to make more money. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Rebecca, do you want to take the next one?
You bet. This is a really good question. What is the best way to approach a coworker who might think has issues, though unintentional, with how they approach stories where race is a factor? What if you feel that their intentions are more serious? Should I go to the union, HR, both? What's your advice on that one?
Who wants to take it first?
Oh, who should jump in? Who should jump in? You all are so fantastic. Go ahead. Anybody that wants to.
Well, I think my colleagues will agree that there is a great level of honesty and debate and discussion in a newsroom. And people are pretty frank, people are pretty blunt. And so I think you just have to confront if someone is saying something or doing something, for example, I know that we had in the beginning of COVID, someone was labeling in our logging system where we save video, was calling it the China virus thing.
No.
That's a problem, right? And so I don't know how that changed, but it did change, and it was no longer called that. And that's why the environment matters, there where people feel like they can speak out. I'll give my particular station credit. I think we do. You know, we're pretty blunt, right? I think when you process the things that we process, which is generally in local news, horrible stuff, right? Crime, bad things happening. I think there's a certain level of frankness and candor that's generally there. So I actually think people would receive it if you just simply, hey, this is a problem.
Thank
I
you.
would confront also. I think going to HR, I don't think that's the way to go in the beginning. I think you just go and have a frank talk with that person and let them say what they were thinking. A lot of times it's implicit bias, and
Right.
you educate.
Right. I would agree with that. I've seen the situation play out a couple of different ways in my past. And regardless of how these individual situations have ended up, I would still say the only way to go is to confront. There are some people that you will need a third party assistance or a witness, at least, in having these conversations, because it shouldn't be just on the person of color to explain it to everyone, especially if you feel that you are in an unhealthy environment. In that situation, have an ally, whether you find it in HR or in somebody else who's listening, but still confront. You can't be afraid. Here's the thing about being a person of color in a newsroom. You really can't be afraid. It's scary, but you really have to be brave. There's no choice anymore. And here's the good thing about this. Rest in peace, George Floyd, and everything that came out of that situation and all the important conversations that had been ever so politely put under the rug. We now have corporate structures designed to uphold healthier conversations. Everyone's trying to look good after this. Everybody's trying to look good after this. And now is really the time that you can take that bravery and say, okay, in page 32 or in slide number 5, you said that I can talk about this without retaliation. So here I am talking about this. What can we do as a group? And so it's hard, guys. It's hard when you think of the people before us and the fights that they had to put up, and the activists, truly the activists, people, women like you, Carolyn, my God, a few years older than I am, you have fought so much harder than I've had to. So if I tell you to keep being PC and to keep upholding these structures to, journalists that are 10 years younger than I am, I mean, we'd be losing the point. Sometimes there is no nice way, but you got to do the best you can to do it honestly, obviously with class, but always with backup, whether with another person next to you listening, if you feel unhealthy, if you feel like it's in an unhealthy situation, or with some HR language to back your move up, because this is an interesting time and it's an emotional time without a doubt. But it's okay. However you're feeling right now, it's okay. You no longer have to be told, quote, the right way to react to racism. We don't have to deal with that anymore. And that is beautiful. I just hope that all of you feel mostly safe moving forward with that.
Lucy, you said something I just want to share when you say, you don't have to be afraid. I think that fear is a natural emotion. I would almost say to people, whether you're afraid or not, live with courage despite your fear, because living with courage, fear is not something maybe you could push away, but in your action of what you guys are actually talking about, once you really activate, all those concerns usually fall away, because now you're leading with with your knowledge, right? You're leading with your power and even if you're afraid, but when you start leading with that, it helps. So I don't want people to feel like they're supposed to think the fear is supposed to go away, because I think the fear kind of is there until you do it, right? Your power comes clearly from your understanding of that experience of speaking out, even in the face of fear. But, that's great. This is really interesting. Did anybody else want to comment on this before I move on? No? Okay. How difficult, this is a really good question, I think, is it for you to report on stories that affect your community while staying objective and not inserting personal opinion? That's an interesting.
Can I just mention very quickly that I have a colleague, well, a former colleague since I'm retired, but she is Chinese American and has taken on a role of reporting, not exclusively, but she gets a lot of tips about anti-Asian sentiment, given this whole China flu, Kung flu, that sort of thing. And she's told those stories about the harassment and the violence that some in that community are dealing with. And she got a hate letter saying, you are not a journalist, you're an activist, and you should be fired. So I am wondering, and I see, Emily, that you are about to talk about that.
Well, I would just say that, I mean, I'm like of the millennial generation. So I think one thing I really like about my generation is that we have really, I think, moved away from the concept of objectivity, especially in journalism. I don't believe it's possible. I don't really believe it actually exists. I think if your objective journalism is the both sides thing, I don't think is really true, because what we're actually trying to get to is truth. And that doesn't necessarily mean objective. That might mean that my personal experience or how I view the world, the lived experience of someone else is truth. So I think that I think some of the best stories come from people who aren't afraid to let their lived experience kind of into their stories. And I think you can do that in a way that's extremely fair. And when we're striving for truth, I think about the Marketplace reporter, Lewis Wallace, who's written so much about this topic. And if you haven't read his book, The View from Somewhere, I would really encourage you to read it. But I think it's taught me a lot about viewing this for myself and my reporting. And I just, I can't hide my identity and who I am in my journalism. And if you read that, you probably know that. And I think I've gotten a lot of praise from people. So I wouldn't be afraid of that.
So I'm on the fringe of being a millennial. I think technically I'm a millennial, but I don't think I fit it squarely in the category, because I remember the world before caller ID, before the digital revolution. Anyway, so so I do believe in objective journalism, and Emily is right. The end should always be truth, and so I think where the problem is if you say, well, we're going to be fair and balanced. I don't think you can always get to truth being balanced, right? I think some voices matter more than others, depending on where the story comes into play. But I think in journalism, you're only as good as the context you can provide. And so the context, the lens through which I operate is based on my knowledge and my experience. So I don't use racially charged. If something's racially charged, it's racist.
Yes.
Police involved, shooting. My God, the cop shot somebody. Although cops try not to use that word. They don't like that, and that's fine. But so that's I think where voices like us matter, because it's how we take on the story. I'm not setting out to be biased, but I certainly have an agenda in terms of making interesting what I think is important. So that's my agenda. But you can do that in a way that's fair and objective, I think.
That's great. Thank you all for the perspective there. Rebecca, you want to do the last question before we move on?
Yeah, this is from one of your colleagues wanting to know, because you can do it here in the way, what are the mistakes that you see your colleagues make when reporting on these issues? What are the things that, now that you can make it anonymous for this setting, they want to know, and that perhaps this reporter wants to know if they've made any of them themselves. So it's this is the place to do it.
Oh goodness, I guess it depends on the context. Like, which story are we talking about, right? Because I'm in what used to be called a duopoly. They really don't call it that anymore. For us, we have a very large, in Philadelphia, our biggest Spanish-speaking population are Puerto Ricans. And so I've seen the mistake before written, the country of Puerto Rico. And it's like, nope, not a country. If you live here, you can vote. If you live on the island, you can't. And the responsibility that we have to assume working in the markets in which we work. I have worked in 4 different markets, and each one has its own responsibility. I've worked in my hometown, and I always try to help. And if you know anything about New Orleans, it is a strange and wonderful, beautiful place. But there's a huge learning curve for an outsider. And I've always tried to be that person to help the kid coming from California, wanting to learn about way beyond Mardi Gras, right? And the same thing with Philly. I've relied heavily on people that have been born and raised to know their nuances and what they're proud of, and what kind of racism is seen here, because it's obviously, racism changes from, you could, for Miami's perfect example. You can call it a minority, but there's not a lot of racism because most Cuban Americans are living among other Cuban Americans. But if you put a Cuban American in, New Orleans, Louisiana, they become a minority again. So you have to really learn, what are the nuances of each market.
Oh,
I think we've lost.
We might have lost Lucy for a
I
second.
know Lucy might have.
Mm,
Well,
We've lost
identifying the market and your audience is important. That's what I was getting from that. Did anybody else want to add to
I thought Emily looked like she was gonna jump in, or maybe she was just leaning forward. I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just like, was that my computer that?
Well, I think this is, go on. Carolyn, were you going to say something?
No, I was saying, I thought it was my computer, like.
Oh, there you go. This is called the Zoom life, everybody. We try to normalize what is just not really normal. That being said, I'm going to take this moment to actually wind up for us. I want to thank you for this discussion. It was wonderful. I can't tell you how much I appreciate each of you. And thank you all for joining this live stream event. I've actually learned a lot today, so I know that our audience has. On behalf of the team here at SAG-AFTRA, we want to thank you for taking time out to be with us. It's been a pleasure having you all join us. I want to say a special thanks to each of you who have been tuning in every week for the President's Task Force on Education, Outreach, and Engagement. These live streams are important, meaningful. They lead us to better places. If you haven't already, while you're here, please subscribe to SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel. Get updates on the great content we're posting. And thank you, everybody, again. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.